Welcome everybody. And my name is Rhonda Burkhauer. Hold on, I'm just admitting people as they come in. My name is Rhonda Burkhauer. I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books, which is an independent bookstore right outside of Boston. And we are thrilled tonight to have with us the feminist poet, photographer, um, writer, oral historian, and social activist, Margaret Randall. And Margaret will be in conversation with Lynn Elizabeth, the founding director of New Village Press. And I personally just want to say I'm happy to see so many friends and old friends here. Um, and I also want to ask people, we're asking people if you can to turn your your video off as well as your audio off. So I think there's a few people that have their video on. If you could turn the video off, because we're asking everyone to do that for this event. Okay. All right, so welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you about another exciting author event this week at Belmont Books, and then just go over some housekeeping details before I introduce Margaret and Lynn Elizabeth. Tomorrow night, Thursday, December 10th at 7:00 p.m., please join us for a fantastic conversation with Zerlina Maxwell for her book, The End of White Politics, How to Heal Our Racial Divide. The author is a regular MSNBC analyst and commentator, so you may have seen her on the news lately. She'll be in conversation with Karen Miller Medzon, the senior associate producer of WBUR's Here and Now. To register for this event, to find out more information about it and about other great events, please visit our website at belmontbooks.com. And now, before I introduce Margaret and Lynn, I just want to ask you again, if you're just joining, to make sure your audio and your video are off. I know some people are joining and have their video on. If you could turn it off for this event, that would be great. Thank you. And even though we can't see you or hear you, we really want to hear your questions and your comments. So at any time during the presentation, please use the chat button that's on the bottom of your screen to write your questions for Margaret and Lynn, and also any comments you'd like to share. What we're going to do is, after the presentation, we're going to reserve about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to ask your questions. And I also would love to encourage you to purchase Margaret Randall's new book, My Life in 100 Objects. It's a wonderful way to support the author, our independent bookstore, and the publisher. This is a beautiful book that I think would make a really wonderful holiday gift, and might even inspire a winter pandemic project of your own. Please check the chat for a link that you can use to order the book on our website at belmontbooks.com. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Margaret Randall and Lynn Elizabeth. Margaret Randall has led a fascinating life. She's a feminist poet, oral historian, photographer, and activist. She's lived in Cuba during the second decade of the revolution, and in Nicaragua during the first few years of the Sandinista revolution. She's lived in Mexico and North Vietnam as well. Her books include Sandino's Daughter, which I still have my copy of from the 1970s, and Women, Terror, and Resistance, among many others. When Margaret returned to the United States in 1984, the government ordered her deported, claiming that her writings were subversive. Thankfully, Margaret won her deportation case and is with us here today. She's won many, many awards, and most recently the 2019 Poet of Two Hemisphere Prize. Tonight, she'll be talking about her newest book, My Life in 100 Objects, which chronicles her very fascinating life in a creative and engaging way. Lynn Elizabeth is the founding director of New Village Press, a nonprofit independent publisher of books on community-based arts, ecology, participatory planning, creative conflict resolution, and social justice. Lynn is the first community member of Imagining America, a national consortium of publicly engaged scholars, artists, designers, and activists working for democratic policies in higher education and civic life. She's the creative co-editor of many collected works, including Works of Heart, Building Village Through the Arts. So now I would like to welcome Lynn Elizabeth, who will provide an additional introduction to Margaret Randall. Okay.
Thank you so
Lynn.
much, Rhonda. I'm so grateful to Belmont Books to have this event. And I also want to say a big hello to so many friends. I see that some friends, including Callie Ronker, who has gifted multiple copies of My Life in 100 Objects to her friends, and then her friends are regifting to their friends. So the book is already going viral just on the holiday gift giving. And there may be more generations of this. Thank you for coming to meet Margaret virtually here. Margaret, as Rhonda has said, is a writer of poetry, prose, oral histories, and essays, and she's the author of more books than she is years old. In fact, she turned 84 this week, and I want to say a big happy birthday to Margaret. Margaret's also a revered translator of poetry, at least 20 published works of translation, and the editor of at least 9 anthologies. She also published 31 issues of the highly respected international bilingual literary quarterly from Mexico, El Corno Emplumado, and the El Corno Press also published a dozen books before Margaret had to flee the country after the student uprising in 1968. I might have thought this incredibly prolific character was mythical, but after I met Margaret, I found out that, yes, she's amazing. She redefines prompt. She tackles every project immediately. She delivers finished work while I'm still pondering the idea. In fact, she is already working on the manuscript for a new book called Artists in My Life, and she's promising a manuscript by March, and I'm still digesting the concept for it. So Margaret is truly a wonder. But this is just statistical. It speaks nothing of the creative fire spirit of this Athena, who has lived and worked and played among revolutionaries and artists in cities that Margaret mentioned. And like a plumed horn of plenty herself, she's been a font of creativity her entire life. So the book that we're celebrating today, My Life in 100 Objects, is a work which shows not only Margaret's writing and poetry, but her photography. I did not mention that Margaret is a known photographer. She's had many exhibitions of her work, but she's had one-woman shows in more than 14 cities. And in Albuquerque, where she lives now, more than 6 exhibitions, one-woman exhibitions. So the Everhart Museum in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is a city that New Village is publishing a book about this May, Scranton, hosted a retrospective of Margaret's photography, her images from Nicaragua and Cuba and other cities in the Americas. So I'm really, really thrilled to have had the opportunity to work with Margaret, and I'm honored to present her to you and to have her do this reading about her work. And so let me switch now to our slideshow. And there it is. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Lynn Elizabeth, as well. I'm happy to be at Belmont Books this evening, even if current conditions still require that we have to get together virtually. And I think that's going to be a while. Before we started tonight, Rhonda told me that the store is 3 years old, an independent bookstore. It's incredible to hear about an independent bookstore starting in the last 3 years. So many are closing. So support your independent bookstores. That's something I always like to say. I appreciate all the work that went into making this Zoom possible. And I'm going to read from my new book, My Life in 100 Objects, as images of the objects that I'm reading about come across your screen. Then my wonderful editor, Lynn Elizabeth, who you've just heard from, and I will talk a bit, and then we'll follow with the Q&A. So please, if you have comments or questions, put them in the chat. I'm going to start by reading just a little bit of the introduction to the book. The idea for this book must have lodged itself in my consciousness several years ago when I first read A History of the World in 100 Objects by the director of the British Museum, Neil MacGregor. Using only items owned by the museum, that book begins with a 2-million-year-old stone chopping tool from the Olduvai Gorge in Eastern Africa and ends with a modern-day credit card. In between, 98 other objects come from the farthest reaches of the globe and represent many dozens of cultures, speaking of the visions people had for their lives, the elegant objects they fashioned, and the solutions they innovated to solve problems we still grapple with. One of the first things that appealed to me about the book, about MacGregor's book, was that its author doesn't distinguish between history and so-called prehistory, whether emerging from a time before or after the written word. All featured pieces display the ingenuity, the creativity, and beauty of their makers. All are voices that speak to us. The object itself is language. And in contrast with so many projects carried out by white European men, it isn't Eurocentric in its focus, but embraces items from every corner of the globe. Cultures from cold climates that produced implements from metal or stone necessarily had an advantage over those from the tropics or ones made from organic materials, which easily disintegrated with the passage of centuries, even millennia. Still, when unique conditions contributed to the preservation of the latter, the British Museum selection included them. This shouldn't surprise me. The British Empire's colonialist plunder knew no limits. Although MacGregor's book is one to which I have frequently returned, delighting in what the images say about those who made them, as well as in the descriptive texts, it didn't occur to me to look at my life in terms of the objects that have shaped it. In 2018, I was putting the finishing touches on my own memoir, I Never Left Home, Poet, Feminist, Revolutionary, which was published by Duke University Press in March of this year. Writing a memoir involves many decisions regarding life events, what to include, what to leave out, what I wanted to say, and how. Objects and places accompanied me in dreams and throughout my waking hours. It was in this context that I remembered my first typewriter, the 1940s Royal Portable, for which I'd earned the money with a paper route at the age of 9. More than 70 years later, I can still smell its faintly oiled matte finish, feel the touch of its keys, their letters and symbols teasing my young fingers from beneath their metal-rimmed, clear plastic windows. Thinking about that typewriter naturally led me to contemplate the Apple computer on which I write today. I remembered my first camera, a sturdy Pentax K1000, and the first photograph I made, of which I was proud, a small girl with a pile of plastic shoes at the foot of a communal staircase in a building at Alamar, the Cuban Revolution's first big housing project. That photograph led me to others that have been important to me, most prominently Ruth Orkin's 1951 American Girl in Italy, an image that displays everyday misogyny like no other. I thought of the clay bread molds I've used for more than 30 years and that still fill our home with the aroma of freshly baked loaves. My worn copy of The Joy of Cooking, and a canvas bag given me the last time I read at iconic City Lights bookstore in San Francisco. The small 4,000-year-old clay head from Laurette Séjourné's 1960s dig at Teotihuacan. Co-joined clay twin figures at a museum in Amman, Jordan, at 8,500 years, considered the oldest surviving sculpture known. A piece of the Berlin Wall, the fake passport I purchased in order to escape Mexico in 1969, and a worn copy of the court transcript from my 1986 deportation hearing. My father's metronome, and a claret cup cactus he gave me. The Levi's and turquoise earrings that have become my trademark apparel. The plain gold bands Barbara and I finally bought when we were able to legally marry after living together for 28 years. One object brought to mind another. I carefully photographed them all and wrote a brief text to accompany each. So I'm going to read these texts now, just a few of them to whet your appetite. And I'm going to start with the text for object number 7. It's called Huipil, Nevaj, Guatemala. Since going to live in Latin America in 1961, I was drawn to huipiles, the richly embroidered blouses worn by indigenous women in Mexico and Guatemala. I wore them over Levi's, taking comfort in their loose-fitting ease and inspiration from their fine needlework that tells the story. In the early 2000s, traveling through Central America, I wanted to go to the Guatemalan mountain village of Nevaj, home of a particularly beautiful huipil. Each version's design is unique to the area in which it's worn. These items of clothing are not simply works of art. They tell us something about the women who wear them, where they're from, whether they are married, widowed, or single, how many children they have. Maps upon which the stories of a life are woven in colored threads. I once asked a native woman if she was troubled by outsiders such as myself wearing huipiles. No, she said, but we don't want you wearing our skirts. Those skirts are wraparound lengths of homespun cloth tucked under at the waist or secured by a woven belt. I was stunned. The huipil seemed so much more of a personal statement than the skirt. Our young Guatemalan guide had never been to Nevaj, but cheerfully set out with us on the 9-hour journey. When we got to the village, she would help us look for the huipiles. But when we arrived, we found the people to be remote, turning away in silence, even when our guide asked where we might find what we were looking for. He was Guatemalan, but apparently almost as much of an outsider as we were. Clearly, this village didn't trust outsiders, probably with good reason. We'd been through the central market and we'd stopped at a dozen or so locals in our search when we began to think we might have made this trip in vain. We'd almost decided to leave. Then my partner, Barbara, spotted a couple of children playing in a park. Her school teacher experience came to the fore and she engaged with them. After a while, she repeated the question we'd been asking of everyone we saw. Do you know where we might be able to find the beautiful huipiles made here? The children took us to their mother, who was welcoming. She invited us to her home for lunch. Her own mother, an ancient-looking woman whose face was a map of creviced skin, said she was too old to party now. She might be willing to sell us her special party huipil. Walking through Navaj's narrow streets, accompanied by locals, made us feel more relaxed. We arrived at the family home, one dark room in a warren of such rooms and connecting courtyards overrun by small domesticated animals, chickens and guinea pigs, and a number of naked toddlers. One child squatted every few minutes to deposit a puddle of diarrhea on the mud floor. Our host ushered us into her personal space, a single all-purpose room, and immediately put a pot of water to boil on a wood stove. She took several enamel bowls from a cupboard and began wiping them with a frayed towel. She could offer us some noodles, she said. The water they were cooked in was flavored with a bit of tomato. Put off by the unsanitary conditions, Barbara and I exchanged a worried glance. Our host caught sight of our hesitation and assured us we didn't need to eat. She understood. Mortified, we told her, no, we were looking forward to what she was preparing. We finished the bowls of ramen-like noodles, which were actually quite tasty. Silently, we promised ourselves we would never again reject such hospitality, even if it made us ill. It didn't make us ill, only ashamed of our own classism. After our shared meal, the older woman opened the bottom drawer of a large armoire and took out a neatly folded huipil. Even after years of use, its beauty was radiant. We asked how much and didn't try to bargain with this woman who was offering us her most treasured piece of clothing. This is how I acquired this exquisite Navajo huipil, made for special occasions in the life of a woman who no longer felt she could look forward to celebrating them. So here is object number 14, Appalachian wooden apple. In 1957, I met the painter Alain de Kooning, who had come to Albuquerque as a visiting professor in the University of New Mexico's art department. We became instant friends. I identified with her free spirit, someone who put creativity at the center of her life. And she was the first woman I knew who seemed able to ignore the gender strictures of the era, although I couldn't yet know at what personal cost. When she returned to New York, I followed. Elaine always bought art from younger or lesser known artists. She understood they needed the money, but that the acknowledgement and encouragement were just as important. She'd even developed a formula for herself. Each time she sold a painting, she would spend roughly a quarter of what she made on such a purchase. Something else I learned from Elaine was to reject the supposed difference between fine art and craft. A piece of art was good or bad, the only distinction that mattered. When Elaine traveled, which was often, she always came home with gifts for her friends. If she saw a particularly beautiful or interesting handmade object, she would buy a dozen or more and spread them around. This is a life-size wooden apple she brought back from Appalachia. She said she found an elderly woman carving them by the side of a country road. At first glance, the cut and teeth marks seem real enough to invite a taste. The inner brown appears to be the fruit's flesh exposed to the air. I've kept this wooden apple because I love it, loved Elaine, and because it reminds me to laugh at the false dichotomy between fine art and craft. So as Rhonda, or maybe it was Lynn Elizabeth mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be able to travel to North Vietnam in 1974. And then again as a tourist many years later, 28 years later. So this object number 34 is a Vietnamese water puppet. In 1974, I traveled to North Vietnam and to the liberated territory of Quang Tri, just below the 17th parallel. The country was still divided. The war in the South still raged. I was living in Cuba at the time, and along with my regular job, volunteered to give weekly English lessons to the man who headed the Voice of Vietnam. I had written a book about Cuban women, and the Vietnamese wanted me to write about their heroic women, many of whom were shouldering the brunt of the struggle. The North Vietnamese Women's Union invited me to visit their country, travel its length, interview its women. They hoped I would write about them. It was an unforgettable experience. I was told I was one of only 9 foreigners in North Vietnam at that time. 28 years later, Barbara and I traveled as tourists to a unified Vietnam. My earlier visit had been a work trip, not one that gave itself to shopping or attending cultural events. This time around, I soaked up the country's rich culture and art, theater, music, puppet shows, museums, even the underground tunnels where the Viet Cong had established schools, factories, and operating theaters beneath US bases during the war. I bought this puppet after an evening at Hanoi's famous water puppet theater. And I'm going to close these readings to leave time for some conversation by reading the text object number 70, American Girl in Italy, a photograph by Ruth Orkin made in 1951. This iconic photograph became an object in my life when I glued a postcard-sized copy to a piece of plywood and propped it on my writing desk. I've read the story of how this photograph was made from the viewpoint of the woman in it. Nina Lee Craig met Ruth Orkin in Florence in 1951. There weren't many American women in that city at the time. The 2 of them were exceptions. They happened to coincide at the American Express office, a place where tourists picked up mail and cashed travelers' checks in those pre-money machine and credit card days. They started talking and realized they were staying at the same hotel, a place that charged $1 a day, including food. Conversing, Orkin wondered if Craig would be willing to model for her by simply walking along a stretch of city sidewalk. You know what? Craig remembers Orkin saying, I bet I could make some money if we just horse around and show what it's like to be a woman alone. Craig was glad to oblige. Decades later, she maintains it was an adventure. When people ask if she was afraid, she always says no. Craig clutched at her shawl and leather shoulder bag as she moved, head held high, eyes straight ahead, through a phalanx of men leering at her from every direction. I count 13 of them in various states of aggressive posture. They're standing in doorways or at the curb, seated at a sidewalk cafe table, mounted on a parked motor scooter. You can almost hear the catcalls and whistles. Orkin is said to have obtained her image on the first or second try. It ran in a 1952 Cosmopolitan magazine photo essay headlined, "When You Travel Alone," that offered tips on, quote, money, men, and morals to see you through a gay trip and a safe one, end of quote. The photo caption reflects the cultural mores of the era. Public admiration shouldn't fluster you. Ogling the ladies is a popular, harmless, and flattering pastime you'll run into in many foreign countries. The gentlemen are usually louder and more demonstrative than American men, but they mean no harm. Two American women, one in front of and the other behind the camera, collaborated on an adventure they both considered good fun. Later, back in the States, they reconnected and remained friends until Orkin's death in 1985. It would be more than half a century before women linked the possessive male gestures that we see in this photo with the misogyny they reflect, the very real and ever-present danger male entitlement encourages. The centuries of cover-up that has meant submission and sexual slavery for women throughout the world. Now we have Me Too, but in many countries, women are still sold into marriage, stoned to death for adultery, denied the freedom to go out alone or to drive. Here in the US, women still get harassed, battered, and raped in shocking numbers. Women still earn less for the same work and are denied employment when pregnant. American Girl in Italy reminds me it remains a man's world, even as women rise. So that much from the book. I don't want to read too many of the 100 entries because I do want you to buy the book if you can, or get it from your library, buy it from your independent bookstore, buy it from Belmont Books. It's a great time to be giving holiday gifts, as Rhonda mentioned. And so I think this is a gift that would go well in the holidays because, this is a kind of an exercise that many people who actually have bought the book say that they've begun to think about the objects in their own lives, and some of them have written about them, which really makes me happy. So let's open it to conversation. I'll give it to you, Lynn Elizabeth.
Lynn, would you like me to ask the questions? Oh, you are muted. Okay. Okay. Lynn, I'll ask.
I didn't realize I was muted.
Okay, that's okay. I will ask the first question and
Okay.
we can go back and forth. So, Margaret, this question is from Nancy Cohn. And she asks, when were you last in Cuba? What are your main memories of your years there? And do you support the campaign to grant the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize to the Henry Reeve Brigade of Cuban doctors working internationally?
Well, thanks, Nancy, for that question. I was in Cuba last year. I would have been there also this year. I've been going 1 or 2 times a year for quite a few years now. Of course, travel is not possible at the moment, but I do keep very close ties with friends in Cuba. I absolutely support the campaign to grant the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize to the Henry Reeve Brigade of Cuban Doctors. In fact, I support those doctors, not only doctors, but health workers of different kinds, the brigades, the Cuban brigades that have gone around the world now for so many years. I actually wrote a book about Cuban solidarity, global solidarity, called uh, Exporting the Revolution. That's a phrase that, of course, is used uh, with ill will in this country of Cuba, um, claiming that they export the revolution, when in fact, the doctors, the teachers, the other specialists who work around the world really don't participate in politics at all. They go to heal, they go to teach, and tens of thousands of them have gone over the last several decades. So I think that Cuba is unique in that respect. And the doctors, the teachers, they go places that often people in the countries in question don't want to go, remote areas, dangerous areas in some cases. So yes, I support that campaign. And although I must say that I don't expect it to bear fruit, not for the Nobel Prize. But yeah, I very much admire those internationalist workers. And what do I remember from my years there? Well, that that would fill several books, and actually has. Um, I lived there for 11 years. I raised my 4 kids there. 2 of them finished their undergraduate work in Cuba. So I was a working woman in Cuba, working mother. My kids went to school, the youngest from daycare up through 5th grade. And then my 2 middle girls, well, my next daughter finished uh, high school, and then came to meet me in Nicaragua. And my 2 oldest, as I say, remained there through their undergraduate work. So what I remember is really daily life. I mean, I lived in Cuba during what I would call the glory years of the revolution, the second decade. Um, a lot of the problems that have emerged since um, didn't exist at that time, or we didn't see them. Things seemed very transparent. And it was really thrilling to be in a country where you knew you were helping to change society, to make it better.
All right, thank you, Margaret. Another question is about actually your writing process. One of our guests was very impressed upon about how prolific you've been and how much you've written. So would really like to know how you maintain discipline in your writing, and if you can give others tips about how to stay disciplined and motivated, and how to overcome anxiety when it comes down to actually sitting down and writing on a daily basis.
That's really an interesting and important question, especially for writers, of course. But my answer is really the answer of an old woman, because I think that we go through different phases in our lives. I can remember when I was young and I was writing books, I was writing them from between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. I always had a job, and I had 4 kids, and so my writing was relegated to after hours. Now that I'm old and I'm retired, I have the luxury of writing the way I want to, and putting it at the center of my life. So my process right now is that I get up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and I start, and my most prolific hours are those early morning hours when there's no phone ringing, when nothing else needs to be done. And so I'll work until about 7 when my wife gets up, and then we have breakfast, and then I go back to work. And I work, or study for work pretty much all day until around 3 or 4 in the afternoon when I'm tired. And then, we'll sort of become couch potatoes or watch TV or whatever, or read, or, when the virus numbers aren't so high, seeing friends and so forth. Um, this issue of writer's block, which you alluded to, I think when you're young, or at least when I was young, and I would get writer's block, or I just wouldn't be able to express myself for a while, I'd be really worried that that was going to last, and maybe I'm not a writer after all, and so forth. But again, as you get older, I think you sort of accept that there are periods when maybe you're thinking more, or you're traveling, or you're mothering, or you're doing something that requires you not to be writing all the time. And then it comes back to you. So when I get stuck at the moment, I'm not worried really anymore, because I know it'll come back. At my age, the sticking point is often around forgetting words, or sitting at the computer, and I know that word, I can see it in my mind, but I can't get it onto the screen. So I've sort of devised little tricks around that. I just leave a space and I keep going. If I ponder it too long, it really gets to me. So I think that our writing styles and our writing habits change over our lifetime. But I think discipline is really important, and that was something that I learned in New York in the late 50s. I learned it from abstract expressionist painters and other poets, that it's not really all about inspiration. It's 90% about discipline.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Next question. First, a comment from Iris Gomez. Thank you for these poignant images and your astute observations. I wonder if each image and text could be used separately, as they might appeal differently to different audiences. And maybe Lynn, you might want to weigh in on that as well.
I think they can be, Iris. I think that I almost look at this book like a deck of very special playing cards. It can be used differently by different people at different times, in however way that they would like to use it. So I think that they can be used separately. I see them sort of as a whole, but that's just me.
Lynn, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I wanted to go back to the previous question, because I wonder the prompts that I wonder about the prompts that you follow, Margaret, because I observe that you're spontaneous. To me, it feels that your creativity is quite spontaneous. It may, in fact, be an illusion from my side. But I also am in awe of how you jump in without hesitation. And there's a high degree of confidence. There doesn't seem to be any equivocation about this direction or that direction. It's leaping into a path, and it can be revising the path once you're on it. But there's that power to move forward that I think is actually quite rare. And I don't know if you feel that you were born with that, or if this is of this particular era of your life, or if you had to develop that.
It's really it's an interesting question. I don't know how rare it is. It's absolutely true with me. I mean, writing to me is absolutely a necessity. It's like a life stream. It's like breathing, or eating, or or loving my family. It's just something that I need to do. And I do tend to, when I get an idea for a book, I tend to sort of jump in. And I'm very aware that my first drafts are not great, you know. But for me, it's important to sort of get the structure down, or get what I think is going to be the structure down. And then I do a tremendous amount of revising. And, you know, it can be 30, 40 revisions before I get a piece to be the way I want it. And of course, that's much easier today with a computer, because I can remember when I started out, you know, the whiteout, the messy carbon paper, the typewriter ribbon sort of getting more and more faded. Um, so that's so easy now, you know, with cut and paste and so forth. So that's sort of my process. I jump in, I do a lot of research, even for poems, even for things that are completely fictitious. I'm very interested in, I read a lot of books about science and technology and archaeology, anthropology, ethnology. That's kind of my favorite reading aside from poetry. So um, when I say that I work all day from 3 or 4 in the morning, what I really mean is that I study and work. I study and then I write. Um, so that's kind of my process. It's to get it all out there, uh, even and as I said before, at the stage in my life when I tend to forget words, maybe I'll put in another word, but I know, but I'll put it in parentheses, and when I come back to it, I suddenly remember the word that I needed. So, you know, I have these little sort of devices, if you like, for helping me through the rough spots. But I like to get into it, and I get into it absolutely fully. I mean, I breathe it, I dream it. I sometimes get up at 1 or midnight because I have an idea and I have to write it down, and if I don't, I'll forget it. And you know, so I'm when I'm in a project, a book project, I'm very, very involved in it. And Barbara has learned to just sort of feed me on time and put up with it. She's very supportive in that respect.
You often are, it seems, are possibly juggling multiple projects, because I know you've been writing poetry about recent politics and COVID. And so perhaps poetry is something that can flow, be, you know, a stream flowing along with the work on books. Or do you have
I'll give you an
also a method?
example.
Go ahead.
This year, I've worked on almost simultaneously on 9 books at once. So one of them was my memoir. One of them was the book that you published, My Life in 100 Objects. Then I was just finishing the memoir at the beginning of the year, and sort of in the middle of 100 Objects. And then I translated a wonderful memoir by someone named Stefano Varese, The Art of Memory, which has just come out. So I was working on that. At the same time, I put together a new collection of poems, which will be out in the spring from Wings Press. It's called Out of Violence into Poetry. And then and then I also finished a book of short essays called Thinking About Thinking. It's still out at several publishers in English, but it's concurrently being translated into Spanish. It'll be out next spring in Mexico. So I've been going over the translations into Spanish as soon as the translator sends them to me. He sends them to me in batches, and I'll go over them. And then the same thing is happening with my book of poetry that's coming out next year from Wings. It's coming out next year also in Chile. So I'm going over those translations. So that's kind of, and then I'm writing this new book. So about art in my life. So I'm doing a number of things and in a number of different genres at a time. And sometimes that gets a little confusing, but usually it's something that I love, because there are moments when, you know, one moves towards poetry. There are moments when I want to say something that I know is better said in an essay, and so forth and so on.
amazing. I just want to let people know, especially my friends who have been loving My Life in 100 Objects, to let them know about your full memoir, because it's magnificent. And if you would like to dive into Margaret's life, this is a great place to start. So, I Never Left Home is a title, and it's published by Duke University Press, and I'm sure you can get it from Belmont Books. So
Thank you. Well, another interesting question for both of you, I think, is, Margaret, how did you come to choose New Village Press and Lynn in the creation of your book? And it would also be nice to hear Lynn talk about the process of, something about the process of selecting and publishing the book. So, Margaret.
Well, I'll just briefly say that what led me to Lynn was a dear friend here in New Mexico named Sabra Moore, a wonderful artist. She actually is going to feature in my new book. And she had published a book with New Village Press called Openings. It's a wonderful, wonderful memoir. It's a personal memoir. There it is. And it's also one of these collective memoirs, because she gives us her very, very interesting life, but she also gives us the women's art movement in the 70s to the early 90s in New York, which was an extraordinary time for women artists protesting the galleries and the museums that wouldn't show them, and the different projects that they did, and Heresies magazine and so forth. So Sabra had published this book with New Village Press, and I was so impressed with the edition of the book. The book has 950 full-colored little tiny photographs that run along the bottom third of every page, plus a couple of signatures of full-page, full-color photographs. And I knew that for the first time. I mean, I was a photographer earlier in my life, and I did a lot, mostly black and white photography, a little bit of color at the end. But I had only once actually done a book that had my color photographs in it. But I knew that for this new book, for My Life in 100 Objects, I wanted the photographs to be in color. And there aren't that many publishers who really do a good job with color, or will take on a book unless you're, a very famous photographer or whatever. So seeing Sabra's book and admiring the way that New Village Press did it, I risked sending them my manuscript, and I struck out. I got lucky.
oh, that's funny. I'm so honored that you brought the book to us, Margaret, because you're a writer of great stature, and I think of New Village Press as a small niche nonprofit press, and so it really was a great thrill for us to have the opportunity to work with you. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I was just bowled over by how responsive you are. You just take care of everything right in the next moment, and that made it a joy to work together. And I really felt a camaraderie and mutual respect and appreciation. So it made everything flow beautifully. So
we've become friends, which is
we
really,
have.
I think, the best. It's the best evidence of working well together when you can become friends.
Yep.
So.
Yep.
And did you want to say anything, Lynn, about the process of, was there anything that stood out in the process of publishing this work?
Oh gosh, well, it was different from any other book that we've published, and so I love when I have the challenge to publish something that's unique. and we have published several books that are just unlike any of the previous ones. In fact, the very first book we published, I remember hesitating about it. I'll just hold this up. This is a crazy aside, but this book is called The Beginner's Guide to Community-Based Arts, and it's cartoon illustrated by a man named Keith Knight, and Matt Schwartzman is his co-author. This was the first book we ended up publishing, and we had hesitated about taking it because it wasn't what I had envisioned. And yet it was stories, profiles of activist artists from across the country that they had taken the time to interview and then to write cartoon illustrated stories about. That book has been reprinted and reprinted and reprinted, and we finally had to do a second edition just to update little facts in it that had gone out of date, because that was 15 years ago that it came out. In fact, the book arrived on the author's doorstep in New Orleans the day before Katrina hit. So there's a whole story there. But and I'll just finish that. We're going to be celebrating that book in January in New Orleans at a po' boy, a sandwich shop. The woman who owns that store believes in eat and read, as she gives away books. And she's buying 80 copies of the book to give away to people in the community. They just come in and buy a sandwich and she gives them a copy. It's, anyway, this is a crazy aside, but to me, it was exciting to have a book come in that was unique. The format was unique, the whole structure of it. And so it's an experiment to put out a work that hasn't been done before. And I've had very good luck with the experiments. And I thank you, Margaret, for also being so creative to, I don't know that it's like any other books that you have published. I mean, you published a lot of books. I mean, authored a lot of books, but is it like others that you have done? That you
No,
have
it isn't. It isn't. And but it's interesting to hear you talk about New Village Press as a niche press, as a little niche press. And I guess that's true, but I just want to say that from an author's point of view, it would be wonderful if we could make money doing what we really love to do, but I'm over that at this point in my life. But the niche presses, some of the independent presses, like the independent bookstores, are what really give us the literature and the reading matter that matters. I mean, it's easy to be, well, I don't know how easy it is, but the big commercial publishers, the chain bookstores, Amazon, they all have their place. I'm not knocking them, but that's not what really, that's not where it's happening in my mind in terms of, pushing our thought process, critical thinking, really engaging with the problems that are so dire today that we're all facing, not just the pandemic and Trump, but just the global warming, so many ways in which our societies have really are doing us in. And the way to listen to people who have ideas about those issues is often to go to the small presses, to the independent bookstores who are not beholden to these great commercial ventures. And that's where you find, I think, what's exciting. So I feel that we belong to the sort of underground network of thinkers and creative people and readers. And, it's what's going to allow us to survive ultimately.
Well,
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you so much for that thought, Margaret. I want to end tonight with a comment to Margaret, a lovely comment by Sally Eiler. And she says, Margaret, it's a pleasure hearing you speak about your life and meeting you virtually tonight. Over 25 years ago, I was given by Elaine de Kooning a poster of a beautiful portrait she painted of you. It's a joy to meet you tonight. You truly have led an inspirational life. So I think
Wow.
that's a wonderful way to end this event.
And I'd love, Sally, I would love to hear from you about that because I'm writing about Elaine right now. I'm writing about that portrait, which she actually had made up in 100 copies. A beautiful, I have a few of them left, and they were sold to make money for my defense fund when I was being deported. And so it's lovely to meet, even on chat, somebody who knew Elaine. So thank you for making that comment.
And one last one here from Anne Kaufman, who met you in Havana in April of 1978, one of 4 US lawyers invited to Cuba by the Federation of Cuban Women. You hosted us at your apartment and then surprised us and took us to the ballet. Whether it was a romanticized dream or actually happened, I think we saw Alicia Alonso dance. I was
We
sure
did,
this
we
was
did.
one of the many interactions you had with visiting Americans, but I just wanted to let you know how meaningful it was for all of us to spend that time with you, to get your perspectives about that incredible time in Cuba and to hear how life was for you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for tonight.
It was
So-
Alicia Alonso, and now I do remember that evening. So I'm glad it was meaningful for you, Anne. It was meaningful for me as well.
All right, Margaret, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful images, your powerful words that tell us about the people and places and art and ideas that really matter to you and tell a story about your life. And thank you, Lynn, so much for your role in bringing this beautiful book to life and also for guiding us through this event tonight and this conversation. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us for this lovely evening. Please visit us at belmontbooks.com or at the store. We are open Tuesday to Saturday from 12 to 6, and we will be open later in the evening, closer to the holiday. So please be well, everyone, be safe, and enjoy saying goodbye to 2021. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Rhonda. Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone. Thank you,
Thank you.
Margaret.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
You.
night, everyone.
Good
Good night.
night.
Good night.